The train stopped in a town the wind never forgave. A woman stepped onto the platform with nothing but a letter that was never meant for her, and a man who swore he never wrote it. What no one expected was that the letter came from a child, a boy brave enough to believe love could fix what grief had broken. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope today. Red Willow Crossing, Montana Territory, autumn of 1893, was the sort of town the wind kept on a short leash. It lay open to the prairie with nothing but low hills in the distance, and the air never learned how to sit still. Even on bright days, the cold found its way through seams and collars, worrying its skin the way worry itself works, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. The main street was a hard ribbon of packed earth scored by wagon ruts, and every boardwalk creaked with the tired complaint of pine that had been nailed too young and left too long in weather. Smoke from cook stoves and coal soot from the rails mixed with the dry bite of sage. Nothing in Red Willow smelled clean. It smelled used. The depot was a narrow, clapboard building with a slanted roof and a platform wide enough for a dozen men to pretend they weren't waiting. A freight stack leaned near the far end, and a telegraph window looked out like a suspicious eye. The train was late, and lateness bred stories. Men shifted their weight, hands tucked in pockets, hats pulled low, watching the track as if they could will the engine into view. Near the telegraph post stood Sarah Vance, the dry goods proprietor. She was tall and spare, built straight through the shoulders and hips, and she carried herself like someone who'd learned not to make room for fools. Her hair, once brown, had gone peppery and was braided down her back, tied with a strip of faded red cloth. Wind had freckled her face and toughened the skin across her cheekbones. Her eyes were pale green, sharp and steady. Sarah spoke only when she had something worth saying, and people listened because she was usually right. Folks remembered when she first arrived in Red Willow with a husband and a wagon full of optimism. They remembered, too, when the husband disappeared and the optimism went with him. The shop stayed. Sarah stayed. That, more than anything, explained her. Down by the freight crates lounged Deke Larn, a drifter with an easy grin and a hard look behind it. He wore a vest that didn't belong to this town and boots that were too clean for a man without land. His mustache was thin and restless, and his eyes moved the way a gambler's did, quickly, always measuring. Deke had a talent for showing up when something might go wrong, and for being absent when anyone started asking who to blame. "If the engineer's got any sense," Deke called, voice pitched for an audience, "he'll keep rolling and spare us the disappointment." Sarah didn't look at him. "If sense ran the rail," she said, calm as a ledger, "you wouldn't be standing here." A few men chuckled. Deke's grin tightened, but he didn't push. He liked his jokes more than he liked consequences. At the far end of the platform stood Calder Boone. He was 34 and looked older in the way the West made men older, less from wrinkles than from what settled behind the eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and solid in a quiet, practical way. His coat was dust-colored and worn at the seams. His hat sat low, shadowing dark brown eyes that did not wander. A neatly kept beard edged his jaw and upper lip, and it did more to emphasize the angles of his face than soften them. He had high cheekbones, a firm mouth, and the stillness of a man who'd learned that movement drew attention. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred, nails rimmed with the kind of ground-in dirt no amount of scrubbing ever truly removed. People in Red Willow didn't say Calder was unfriendly. They said he was careful. 2 years back, a flash flood took his sister and her husband at a creek crossing. Calder had ridden into the storm after them and come back alone, carrying a boy wrapped in his coat. He'd spoken even less after that. The ranch still ran, the cattle still moved, Calder still paid his debts. But laughter became rare in his orbit, like a bird that no longer trusted the season. At his boot sat a dog named Moat, a mottled blue-gray cattle dog mix with one brown eye and one pale eye that made him look perpetually skeptical. Moat was middle-aged by dog standards, wiry, alert, and loyal to a fault. He watched everything that moved, ears pricked, tail mostly still. Now and then he glanced up at Calder as if checking orders. Calder had not come for freight, and he had not come because he enjoyed standing among townsfolk. He was there because the sheriff's deputy had ridden out the day before with a folded paper and a look that didn't belong on a man's face unless trouble was on it. A woman was arriving on the morning train, the deputy said. She carried a letter. The letter bore Calder Boone's name. Calder had read the deputy's note twice. He hadn't written any such letter, hadn't asked for a bride, hadn't asked for anything from anyone in a long time. Yet his name had been used. And in a town like Red Willow, names mattered more than explanations. If he didn't meet the train, the story would grow teeth before it ever found the truth. A whistle finally cut through the wind, long, low, metallic, and the platform shifted. Men straightened, hats tipped, a few stepped closer to the edge. The engine appeared as a black shape against the pale prairie, dragging its line of cars like a chain. It slowed with a grinding complaint, brakes screeching, steam hissing out in sharp bursts that smelled of coal and hot oil. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt tense rather than peaceful, as if the town had taken a breath and decided not to release it yet. Passengers disembarked in a loose spill, rail workers with soot on their collars, a trader clutching a battered valise, a preacher with a narrow trunk and a hopeful face that looked out of place here. They moved away quickly, heads down, already eager to be elsewhere. Then, from the last passenger car, a woman stepped down. Her name was Lydia Rowan. She was not dressed for spectacle. She wore a dark gray traveling dress, plain but well made, the kind a woman chose when she wanted to be treated as serious and didn't care to be called pretty. The fabric carried the journey, coal smudged near the hem, dust in the seams, a crease at the elbow. Her hat was simple felt, pinned securely, but the wind still worried a few strands of auburn hair loose around her face. Her skin was fair, yet weathered enough to suggest she had spent time outdoors for reasons other than leisure. Her eyes were hazel, steady, and direct. She held a small carpet bag in one hand and kept a folded letter close to her chest with the other, as if it were both map and proof. The platform quieted, not because people were polite, but because she had brought novelty, and novelty always drew the town's attention like blood drew flies. Deke Larn let out a low laugh. "Well," he said, "looks like someone's got themselves delivered." Sarah's gaze sharpened, and the set of her mouth told Deke to be careful. Lydia stepped onto the platform and paused. She scanned faces without hesitation, not searching for kindness so much as searching for fact. Her attention found Calder quickly. Perhaps it was because he stood apart. Perhaps it was because he didn't stare at her like he had a right to. He simply watched, composed, as if he were bracing for a task rather than a moment. She walked toward him, measured and steady. Moat's head lifted. A faint warning sound gathered in the dog's throat. Calder didn't hush him. He trusted Moat's judgment. Lydia stopped a few paces away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough not to presume. "Mr. Boone?" she asked. Her voice was controlled, lower than many women's, trained by manners and reinforced by practice. "Calder Boone?" "That's my name," Calder said. She nodded once, then drew the letter from her chest and held it out, not accusing, not pleading, just offering the truth she had paid to bring here. "I came because of she said. "It's signed with your name." Calder didn't take it. His eyes moved over the paper, then returned to her face. "I never sent for a bride," he said, each word deliberate. "I never wrote you." The crowd shifted. Someone muttered. Deke's smile widened, sensing entertainment. Sarah remained still, watching Lydia more than she watched Calder. Lydia's expression tightened at the edges, not anger, not shock, but the controlled disappointment of a woman whose instincts had already prepared her for this. She held the letter steady. "Then you can send me back," she said, clear enough for the whole platform to hear. "I'll take the next train out." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't melodrama. It was a statement of dignity. Lydia Rowan did not sound like someone begging to be chosen. She sounded like someone refusing to be made foolish in public. Calder looked at her for a long moment. He could see the strain beneath her composure. The travel, the risk, the humiliation held back by a straight spine and a steady gaze. In the corner of his vision, he saw Sarah's eyes narrow, less judgment than appraisal, as if Sarah were deciding what kind of woman this was. Before Calder could answer, movement flickered near the freight crates. A boy slipped out from behind them, small and thin, hair the color of dry wheat, cheeks red from cold and running. His shirt hung a little too loose at the shoulders, and his sleeves were rolled twice. His boots were too big, scuffed and dusty, and he walked with the serious concentration of someone trying not to be seen and failing. His name was Eli Boone, Calder's nephew, the child he'd carried out of floodwater and into a house that still smelled like loss. Eli stopped beside Calder, not behind him. His hands clenched at his sides. He looked at Lydia with wide eyes that held more hope than sense. Adults in Red Willow didn't like that kind of hope. It made them feel accused. "Miss," Eli said, voice unsteady but determined. Are you the one from the letter?" Lydia's gaze dropped to him, surprise breaking through her composure. Her shoulders softened slightly. "What letter?" she asked, gentle despite herself. Eli swallowed. "The one I sent," he said. The platform went still, the way a room went still when a child spoke a truth no one wanted to handle. Even Deke's grin faltered, uncertain whether to laugh or stay quiet. Calder's breath caught. He looked down at Eli, then back at Lydia, and the pieces arranged themselves with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Eli had been quiet lately, watching people's hands when they wrote, lingering near Sarah's shop window where letters and ribbon were displayed, asking too many questions about trains. Calder had assumed it was restlessness. He hadn't imagined this. "Eli," Calder said, voice rough, "what did you do?" Eli didn't look away. His face flushed, but he stood his ground. "You're sad," he whispered, as if naming it might fix it. "You don't laugh. I thought if a good lady came, maybe you would." Lydia's fingers tightened on the paper. Calder could see her swallow once, carefully, as if she were keeping something from spilling out in front of strangers. She had come for a promise, and a child had been the author of it. The train hissed behind them, impatient, its engine breathing steam like a warning. The wind tugged at Lydia's skirt, at Eli's sleeves, at the loose end of Sarah's braid. Calder felt the town waiting to turn this into ridicule, waiting to decide whose shame would be easiest to carry. He lifted his head and looked at the faces around him, ranch hands, miners, shopkeepers, drifters. He knew how quickly a story could become a sentence here. If he hesitated, Lydia would be fed to the town's cruelty, and Eli would learn the wrong lesson about courage. Calder placed a firm hand on Eli's shoulder, steadying him, then spoke to Lydia in a voice that carried without needing to shout. "My name's on that letter," he said. "So the fault is mine to answer for." Lydia held his gaze, her expression unreadable, but her posture unbroken. Calder exhaled slowly, then said the words that would change how this town spoke about her, whether she wanted that change or not. "My boy chose you," he said. A murmur rose along the platform. Some curiosity, some disapproval, some smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Sarah watched Lydia carefully, as if waiting to see whether she would crumble or sharpen. Lydia didn't step closer. She didn't reach for Calder. She looked at Eli, then back at Calder, and asked quietly and plainly, "And what do you choose, Mr. Boone?" Calder didn't answer at once. The question hung between them. Simple. Unavoidable. The wind seemed to pause at the edge of it, as if even the prairie wanted to hear what a man like Calder Boone would do when silence was no longer enough. And Red Willow Crossing, harsh and hungry as it was, held still for one breath longer than it usually did. Red Willow Crossing did not explode into noise after Calder Boone spoke. It rarely did. The town absorbed words the way dry ground absorbed rain, slowly, skeptically, deciding what to keep and what to let run off. The murmur that followed was low and uneven, made of questions rather than conclusions. Calder felt it press in from all sides, the weight of attention settling on his shoulders with a familiarity he did not enjoy, but understood. He had lived long enough among these people to know that silence here was never empty. It was a ledger being balanced. Lydia Rowan remained where she stood. She did not rush to fill the space. Calder's words had opened. Her posture stayed straight, chin level, fingers still wrapped around the folded letter as if it might anchor her. She was used to waiting for rooms to quiet, for men to finish deciding whether to listen, for circumstances to show their true shape. The question she had asked him lingered between them, unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because some answers required more than breath. Eli shifted beside Calder, suddenly aware that he had pulled a grown world onto himself. His shoulders tensed, and he looked up at his uncle, uncertainty flickering across his face. Calder squeezed the boy's shoulder once, firm and reassuring, a small promise made without ceremony. Moat rose to his feet, nails clicking softly against the boards, and positioned himself closer to Eli, as if the child were part of the flock now under his watch. Sarah Vance was the first to move. She stepped away from the telegraph post and walked toward the center of the platform, boots steady, expression unreadable. She stopped a few paces from Lydia and looked her over with a shopkeeper's eye, assessing durability rather than beauty. "The next eastbound won't come till morning," Sarah said evenly. "And the hotel's been closed since spring." Lydia met her gaze. "I don't require comfort," she replied. "Only a place to wait." Sarah nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than politeness. "We've got a room above the Black Horse," she said. "It's not quiet, and it won't pretend to be safe, but the door locks." Deke Larn laughed under his breath. "That's generosity, Sarah." Sarah turned her head just enough to fix him with one pale eye. "It's decency," she said. "You should try it sometime." Deke's smile thinned. He shrugged and backed away, hands raised in mock surrender, already searching for a new angle to the story. The sheriff arrived late, as he often did. Thomas Hale was a broad man in his early 50s, with a graying beard that he kept trimmed more out of habit than vanity. His belly pushed against his vest, and his eyes carried the permanent weariness of someone who spent his days mediating other people's poor decisions. Hale had come west young and hopeful, like many men, and stayed long enough for hope to turn into routine. He believed in order, not justice, and that belief had served him well enough. "What have we got?" Hale asked, adjusting his hat and scanning the faces. "A letter with my name on it," Calder said simply. "And a woman who came here in good faith." Hale's gaze settled on Lydia, then on Eli, then back to Calder. He exhaled through his nose. "We'll talk," he said. "Not here." The decision, small as it seemed, rippled outward. People took it as permission to disperse, to carry pieces of the scene back to porches and saloon tables. The train hissed again, doors slamming, the engine preparing to leave Red Willow Crossing with or without resolution. Lydia stepped aside as the last of the passengers moved past her, her arrival already becoming something the town would reframe by nightfall. Calder walked Lydia to the edge of the platform, not touching her, not crowding her. "You can stay till morning," he said. "No one will force you onto a train you don't want." "I didn't ask to stay," Lydia replied, her voice calm but not unkind. "No," Calder said, "but you didn't ask to be summoned either." That earned a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a reluctant appreciation of plain truth. She inclined her head slightly, then followed Sarah toward the boardwalk that led to the saloon. The Black Horse Saloon squatted at the corner of Main and River like a structure that had long ago given up on respectability. Its sign creaked on rusted chains, paint flaking away to reveal older letters beneath. Music leaked from inside in uneven bursts, piano notes struck too hard, laughter edged with drink. The stairs to the rooms above were narrow and steep, worn smooth by boots and desperation. The room Sarah unlocked was small but clean enough. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, a washstand beside it, a single window overlooking the street. The lock clicked firmly when Sarah tested it. "You keep the lamp lit," she said. "It discourages ideas." "Thank you," Lydia said, and she meant it. Below, Calder did not leave. He tied his horse to the post outside the saloon, the animal shifting its weight patiently. The horse was a dark bay gelding named Ash, 12 years old, scarred at the shoulder from an old wire cut but steady as they came. Ash lowered his head and sighed as Calder loosened the reins, the sound of a creature accustomed to waiting. Calder took a seat on the bench under the overhang. He didn't go inside. He didn't speak to anyone. Moat lay at his feet, eyes half-lidded but alert. People noticed. They always did when Calder chose to remain visible. Some took it as a claim, others as a challenge. Calder didn't bother correcting them. He was there because a woman slept above a saloon on his name, and because a boy he loved had written a letter without understanding what it might cost. Upstairs, Lydia unpacked slowly. She laid her gloves on the washstand, folded her dress with care, and placed the letter on the small table near the window. From there she could see the bench below, the outline of Calder's hat, the steady presence of him. She did not wave. She did not signal. She simply acknowledged the fact of him and turned back to her own thoughts. Sleep came late and light. The saloon's noise ebbed and surged, then ebbed again. When Lydia finally closed her eyes, it was with the knowledge that the world had shifted under her feet and that standing still would no longer be an option. Morning arrived cold and clear. The wind had not tired itself overnight. Lydia opened the door and stepped onto the landing. Below, the bench was empty, but a second chair had been dragged close during the night, its seat still faintly warm when she touched it. She stood there longer than she intended, then straightened and went back inside. By mid-morning, the town had decided it wanted answers. Sheriff Hale called a hearing at the courthouse, a narrow, sun-baked room beside the chapel with benches that creaked and windows that let in more light than mercy. Men filled the front rows, arms crossed. Women stood along the walls. Lydia sat alone, hands folded in her lap, back straight. Calder took a seat behind her with Eli beside him, Moat lying under the bench. On the table lay the letter. Hale read it aloud, his voice flattening the childlike script into something heavier than it had been meant to be. A few people chuckled, then stopped when the sound felt wrong. When Hale finished, he set the paper down carefully. "This letter was sent under Mr. Boone's name," he said. "That brings confusion. Confusion brings trouble." Calder stood before Hale could ask. He moved to the front of the room, boots loud against the floor. He didn't look at Lydia. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the letter. "My name's on it," he said. "That's enough. I'll answer for it." Hale raised an eyebrow. "Even if it costs you?" Calder nodded once. She came here in good faith. The decision was swift. A fine, a suspension of his cattle contracts for the winter season. It would hurt. Everyone knew it. Calder accepted without argument. When it was over, Lydia did not thank him. She did not speak to him at all. Shame sat heavy in her chest, not because he had acted wrongly, but because she had let someone else carry the cost of her arrival. That afternoon, she left Red Willow Crossing on foot, heading toward the mining camps east of town. She didn't leave a note. She carried her bag, her books, and the quiet resolve of a woman who would not live as a debt. Calder watched her go from the edge of town, hands at his sides, understanding at last that choosing to stand was only the beginning of what the wind had set in motion. The road east of Red Willow Crossing was not a road so much as a suggestion agreed upon by wagons that had passed through often enough to leave memory in the ground. It wound away from town in a pale scar, cutting through low scrub and stones bleached smooth by years of wind. Lydia Rowan walked it with steady steps, her carpetbag thumping lightly against her leg, her breath fogging faintly in the cold morning air. She did not look back, not because she was proud, but because she understood how easily looking back could become an invitation to doubt. The mining camp sat 3 miles out, crouched against a shallow rise like it was trying not to be seen. Smoke drifted low from cook fires, gray and sour, clinging to the ground instead of rising. Shacks leaned into one another for balance, boards mismatched, roofs patched with tin and tar. Children moved through the camp barefoot despite the cold, their laughter sharp and brief, like sparks that refused to catch. Men came and went with lunch pails and tired eyes, shoulders stooped not only from labor but from the certainty that no one expected better of them. Lydia paused at the edge of it, taking in the place the way she had been taught to take in unfamiliar rooms. Note the exits, note the silences, note who was watching. She felt no fear, only the familiar tightening that came before work. This was not Baltimore. There were no clean halls, no chalkboards waiting patiently on walls. There was only need, raw and immediate, and Lydia had learned long ago that need could be shaped if someone was willing to stay long enough. She approached a cook fire where a woman knelt stirring beans in a dented pot. The woman was in her early 30s, broad-shouldered and strong through the arms, her dark hair pulled into a loose knot that had surrendered strands to sweat and ash. Her face was lined more from sun than age, and her mouth held a permanent downturn, as if it had forgotten how to relax. This was May Cutter, though Lydia would not learn her name until later, a widow who had buried her husband 2 winters back when a tunnel collapsed, and the company marked the death as unavoidable. "I used to teach," Lydia said without preamble, her voice calm and clear. "Reading, numbers, I can do it again." May snorted softly, not unkindly but without hope. Ain't a school here, she said. Ain't walls neither. There will be, Lydia replied. May looked up at her then, eyes dark and appraising. She took in Lydia's clean dress, her straight spine, the lack of apology in her stance. You planning on staying long enough to build one? She asked. I am, Lydia said, and for the first time since leaving town, she smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just enough to let the woman know she meant it. No one offered help that day. Lydia did not expect it. She found an abandoned lean-to near the edge of camp, 3 walls still standing, the 4th long since surrendered to weather. The roof sagged, half collapsed, and the floor was dirt-packed hard by years of use. Lydia swept it out with a broken branch. She dragged crates into rough rows. She unpacked the slate board she had carried wrapped in cloth and leaned it against the wall. By the time the sun dipped low, her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, but the space looked less like a ruin and more like a beginning. For 3 days, the children watched from a distance. They hovered at the edge, whispering, daring one another to step closer. Lydia wrote letters on the slate with a piece of coal she had scavenged from a fire pit. She wrote her own name first, large and steady. Then she sat and waited. On the 4th day, a boy with hair cropped too short and a jacket 3 sizes too big took a seat on a crate. He didn't speak. He simply watched her hands as if they were performing a trick. By the end of the week, there were 8 children, then 10. Lydia learned their names. She learned who could not yet hold a pencil steady, who pretended not to care, who learned faster than they let on. She taught them anyway. What Lydia did not see were the eyes on her from beyond the rise. Calder Boone rode out to the mining camp at dusk on the 7th day. He did not ride straight in. He stopped his horse, Ash, at the crest of the hill and looked down. The camp glowed faintly with firelight. He could hear the murmur of voices, the thin sound of children reciting letters, uneven but earnest. Calder felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with recognition. He did not approach. He turned Ash around and rode back toward town, the decision settling in him with the weight of necessity. 2 days later, Calder led Shadow into Red Willow Crossing. Shadow was the finest horse Calder had ever broken, a black stallion with a white star on his brow and eyes that missed nothing. He was 7 years old, powerful without being reckless, and he moved like he understood the value of restraint. Calder had raised him from a colt, spoken to him more than he spoke to most men. Shadow's coat shone even in poor light, and when he tossed his head, people noticed. At the trading post, a buyer from Helena waited. His name was Marcus Klein, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and a voice that carried authority without effort. He wore city boots and gloves too fine for red willow dust, but his eyes were honest. He knew good stock when he saw it. That's a hell of an animal, Klein said, walking slow around Shadow. You sure? Calder nodded. Take care of him. Klein hesitated, then counted out the money without haggling. Calder refused the offered commission, took the cash, and left without explanation. The envelope reached the church 2 days later, sealed and unsigned. Inside was enough money to repair the lean-to roof, buy benches, slates, chalk, and a small bell. The preacher, Elias Mercer, a thin man with gentle eyes and a voice that shook when he was nervous, delivered it to the mining camp with a puzzled smile. Seems, he said carefully, that Providence is paying attention. Lydia did not ask where the money came from. She recognized quiet generosity when she saw it. She put the funds to use immediately. By the end of the week, the roof no longer leaked, and the children rang the bell themselves at the start of lessons, laughter echoing across the camp like a challenge to despair. It was on her walk back toward town one evening that Lydia noticed the corral at the Boone place was too quiet. She stopped at the fence, fingers curling around the weathered rail. The space where Shadow always stood was empty. The trough was clean, the ground undisturbed. Lydia knew enough about men and land to understand what that absence meant. That night, she walked to the Boone house. Calder opened the door before she knocked. He stood framed by lamplight, coat off, sleeves rolled, his hair damp from washing. The lines of his face were deeper in the softer light, the angles less severe but no less resolute. He did not look surprised to see her. You sold him, Lydia said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Calder did not deny it. He stepped aside, leaving the door open. Lydia did not enter. She stayed on the porch, the night air cool against her skin. You didn't save me, she said after a moment, her voice low but steady. You gave me room to stand. Calder met her gaze. He did not smile. He did not explain. He nodded once, the motion small but sincere. "That's all I ever intended," he said. Lydia looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back down the path, the lamplight behind her fading into the dark. Calder watched until she disappeared beyond the rise, just as he had at the edge of town days earlier. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, restless but less sharp. Somewhere east, a bell rang, thin and clear, and something that had begun with a child's letter was quietly becoming a foundation. The first snow did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, thin flakes drifting sideways on the wind, dissolving the moment they touched ground, as if the land itself were not yet ready to accept winter. Red willow crossing woke beneath a sky the color of dull tin, and the town moved more slowly, every sound softened, every step cautious. Snow like that made people uneasy. It suggested permanence without committing to it. Lydia Rowan noticed the change before most. The children at the mining camp huddled closer together during lessons, their fingers stiff, their breath visible as they sounded out letters. She adjusted the schedule without comment, shortened the day, and sent them home before the cold could sink too deep. Practical kindness had always been her language. The bell rang once, clean and bright, and the children scattered, boots kicking up dust and promise in equal measure. She was packing the slate when she felt it, that subtle tightening at the back of her neck that came when the world shifted without asking. Lydia straightened slowly and looked toward the road that wound back to town. A carriage was coming. It did not belong. Most wagons that reached the mining camp were patched and patient, pulled by mules who knew the way better than their drivers. This carriage was polished black, its wheels iron-rimmed and clean, its lines precise. The horse pulling it was a tall chestnut with a glossy coat and clipped mane, trained for streets rather than trails. The driver sat stiff-backed, reins held too carefully, eyes forward and uncurious. The carriage stopped at the edge of camp, and the man who stepped down did so like he expected the ground to accommodate him. His name was Charles Whitaker. He was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with narrow shoulders and a posture shaped by offices rather than open land. His coat was dark wool, tailored close, and his boots shone despite the dust. A gold watch chain crossed his vest, catching the light. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw sharp, his mouth practiced into an expression of polite authority. He wore his confidence the way men from the East often did, not loud but unquestioned. His eyes were pale blue and assessed the camp as if it were an inconvenience rather than a reality. Lydia recognized him instantly. Time had not softened him. It had only refined the edges. She didn't move toward him. She didn't retreat. She simply stood, slate under her arm, and waited. "Miss Rowan," Whitaker said, voice smooth, controlled, "you've gone to some trouble to disappear." "I haven't disappeared," Lydia replied. "I've relocated." Whitaker's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He gestured back toward the carriage. "We should speak privately." "There's nothing private between us," Lydia said. "There hasn't been for some time." Whitaker glanced around the camp, the shacks, the children lingering at a distance, the smoke and the dirt. Distaste flickered before he masked it. "You were meant for more than this," he said quietly. "We had an agreement." Lydia felt the familiar, unwelcome pressure of old words. Agreement, obligation, family arrangement, words that had once been used to dress confinement as opportunity. "You had an expectation," she said. "I had a choice." Whitaker reached into the carriage and withdrew a leather folio. He didn't open it yet. "The law does not concern itself with your feelings," he said. "You are named. You are bound." The children watched now, silent and alert. May Cutter stood near the cook fire, arms crossed, her expression hardening. Lydia took a breath. She had known this might come. Promises made without consent had a way of growing teeth. "You should leave," Lydia said. Whitaker smiled thinly. "I don't intend to." By the time the carriage reached Red Willow Crossing an hour later, the town had already sensed trouble. Outsiders brought more than goods. They brought disruption. Whitaker wasted no time. He went straight to the sheriff's office, papers in hand, boots striking the boardwalk with deliberate certainty. Sheriff Hale listened with the patience of a man who did not enjoy surprises. Whitaker laid out his case methodically. An engagement contract signed in Baltimore, letters exchanged, arrangements made with Lydia's family. He framed it as concern rather than possession, responsibility rather than control. "I'm here to retrieve what is lawfully mine," Whitaker said. Hale frowned. "She came of her own accord," he said. Whitaker inclined his head. "Under false pretenses. Your citizen's name was used to lure her here. That alone warrants review." The sheriff sighed. "This town doesn't care much for Eastern paperwork." Whitaker's eyes hardened. "Federal courts do." Word spread quickly. By the time Lydia walked into town that afternoon, people were already gathering, drawn by instinct rather than invitation. She did not look for Calder Boone. She didn't need to. She knew he would come. Whitaker stood in the middle of Main Street, papers held neatly in one hand, the other resting lightly on the head of his cane, a useless affectation, more symbol than support. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Rebecca," he began, then corrected himself with irritation. "Lydia, you are required to return with me. This situation has gone far enough." Lydia stopped a few paces away. Her face was calm, her back straight. "If I belonged to you," she said evenly, "you would not have had to come this far." A murmur moved through the crowd. Whitaker lifted the papers. "The law is not optional in this territory." "It wasn't optional in Maryland either," Lydia replied. "Yet here I stand." That was when Calder stepped out from the side street. He had not hurried. His pace was steady, his presence immediate. He wore his coat open, his hat low, his beard neatly trimmed but shadowed by days of fatigue. The lines of his face were deeper now, the cost of recent choices written plainly. Moat walked at his heel, ears forward, posture alert. Calder did not look at Lydia. He did not address Whitaker directly at first. He positioned himself beside Lydia, close enough that their sleeves brushed. Then he rested one hand on her shoulder, not possessive, not protective in the way Whitaker expected, but grounding. Lydia didn't flinch. "She stays because she chooses to," Calder said. His voice was low, even, and carried farther than Whitaker's ever could. "That's the only law that matters here." Whitaker's gaze snapped to Calder. "And you are?" he asked, though he already knew. "Calder Boone." Whitaker's lips curved faintly. "Ah, the rancher with the letter problem." Calder did not react. He held Whitaker's gaze with the patience of a man used to weather. "You're done here," he said. Whitaker laughed softly. "You mistake yourself for authority." The crowd shifted. May Cutter stepped forward. Sarah Vance appeared at the edge of the street, arms folded, eyes sharp. The preacher stood near the chapel steps, Bible tucked under one arm, his presence quiet but resolute. Parents from the mining camp gathered, their children behind them, slates under their arms. Whitaker took it in, the numbers, the stance, the lack of deference. For the first time, calculation replaced certainty in his expression. Sheriff Hale cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "this will require review." Whitaker's jaw tightened. He nodded stiffly. "Of course. I'll await your decision." The review took 2 days. During that time, Whitaker stayed at the best room in the hotel, sent telegrams east, and spoke little. Lydia returned to the mining camp each morning and taught as usual. Calder did not follow her, but he was never far. He repaired fences, mended tack, did the work that could not be delayed, and waited. On the 3rd day, the federal agent arrived. His name was Samuel Brooks, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and eyes that missed little. He wore a tailored coat that had seen travel and boots that bore honest scuffs. He carried himself without arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He listened more than he spoke. Brooks reviewed the papers. He walked the mining camp. He watched Lydia teach. He listened to the parents speak, not eloquently, but sincerely. He took notes. That evening, Brooks sat with Sheriff Hale and wrote a single-page report. The next morning, Whitaker was summoned. Brooks read the decision aloud. Voluntary relocation, no coercion, community contribution noted, no further action. Whitaker's face drained of color. "This is irregular," he said. "So is life," Brooks replied. Whitaker left town before noon. That night, Lydia stood outside the Boone house as the first real snow began to fall. Calder opened the thermos. door and met her without surprise. "It's over," she said. Calder nodded. "I know." She looked at him, really looked, at the man who had stood without claiming, who had given without demanding. "I'm not staying because you protected me," she said. "I'm staying because I choose this place." Calder stepped aside and held the door open. "Then come in," he said, "and we'll figure the rest out." Snow settled on the roof, quiet and sure. Winter settled into Red Willow Crossing the way some truths did, without ceremony, without asking permission, and with the quiet confidence that it would not be leaving any time soon. The snow that followed Whitaker's departure came heavier and stayed longer, packing itself into corners of roofs and fence rails, dulling sound and softening edges. The town learned a new rhythm. Boots were brushed before stepping inside. Fires were banked early. Words like warmth were used more carefully. Lydia Rowan no longer slept above the Black Horse Saloon. She had not moved the night Whitaker left, not out of fear or indecision, but because she believed in finishing things properly. She taught her class the following morning as usual, her voice steady, her movements precise. Only when the children had gone and the slate was clean did she walk back toward town, her bag light, but her thoughts weighted. Calder Boone did not meet her on the road. He did not offer escort or explanation. He simply waited at his house, the door unlatched. The Boone place sat a mile outside town, tucked against a low rise where cottonwoods clustered near a narrow creek. The house was solid but plain, built of weathered timber with a wide porch that faced east. It bore the marks of care rather than ambition, straight lines, mended corners, a roof kept honest against the seasons. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a thin, steady line. When Lydia reached the porch, she paused, not because she doubted the decision, but because she understood its weight. A woman stepping into a man's house in a town like this changed the shape of stories whether she meant to or not. Calder opened the door before she knocked. He had cleaned. That much was obvious. The floor had been swept, the table cleared, a kettle warming on the stove. The scent of lavender drifted faintly from the open window, carried in from a sachet Lydia recognized as something Sarah Vance sold behind the counter, quiet luxuries for women who had learned to hide them. Calder stood back, leaving space rather than claiming it. "You can take the big room," he said. "I'll use the office." Lydia looked past him, taking in the house with a teacher's eye. There were no unnecessary things. A rifle rack by the door, tools hung neatly along one wall, a shelf of ledgers and books worn from use. On the mantel rested a small framed photograph turned face down. She did not ask. "I'm not here because I owe you," Lydia said. Calder met her gaze. "I wouldn't have asked if you did." That was enough. She stepped inside. Eli burst through the back door moments later, snow clinging to his boots and hair bright from cold. He stopped short when he saw Lydia standing near the hearth, her coat folded over her arm. "Ma's home," he said without thinking. The word hung there, fragile and untested. Calder did not correct him. He did not encourage it either. He simply took Eli's coat and hung it by the door, his movements calm, his silence deliberate. Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, not because of the word, but because no one rushed to define it. That night, Lydia slept in the big room. The bed was wide and solid, the quilt heavy with the smell of sun and soap. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, Calder's quiet footsteps down the hall, the murmur of Eli's breathing from the next room, the wind testing the windows. She did not feel like a guest. She did not feel claimed. She felt, for the first time in a long while, placed. Life adjusted around her presence without announcement. Lydia rose early and prepared breakfast as if she had always done so, her movements efficient, her choices thoughtful. Calder did not hover. He accepted. Eli followed her like a shadow, eager and watchful, offering help where he could and questions where he could not. The schoolroom at the mining camp closed for the winter weeks later, the road becoming too slick, the air too sharp. Lydia began teaching from the Boone house instead. Word spread quietly. Children from nearby homesteads came in the mornings, their mothers lingering at the door, their fathers nodding stiffly before returning to chores. Lydia set aside the parlor, rearranging furniture, hanging the slate board near the window where light was best. The sound of recitation replaced the creak of unused floorboards. Calder's house became fuller, not louder, but richer in purpose. Not everyone approved. Deke Larn lingered near the dry goods store more often now, his comments sharpened by drink and envy. He muttered about arrangements and appearances, about men who lost their edge when they let women decide things. Sarah Vance shut him down with a look that suggested he would regret pushing further. Still, stories traveled faster than truth. The letter arrived a week before Christmas. It was delivered by a rider from the county seat, a young man with a narrow face and eyes too serious for his age. The envelope was thick, the seal official. Lydia opened it first, her hand steady. It was a formal complaint filed by Charles Whitaker. Accusations of unlawful harboring, coercion, moral misconduct. The language was cold, precise, sharpened for harm rather than resolution. Calder read it after her. His jaw tightened, the muscles at his temple flexing once. He did not curse. He folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. "They won't find what he's looking for," Lydia said. "No," Calder replied, "but they'll look." The federal agent arrived 2 days later. His name was Nathaniel Reed, younger than Brooks, with sandy hair cut short and a mustache he kept trimmed to regulation. He wore a wool coat that had seen travel and boots that bore honest wear. His eyes were gray and observant, and he spoke little, preferring to listen. Reed had grown up on a small farm in Iowa before taking the badge. He understood land and labor better than most men in his position. Reed asked questions. He watched Lydia teach. He spoke with parents. He walked the property with Calder, noting the repairs made, the work done, the absence of excess. He spoke with Eli alone, crouching to the boy's level, asking simple things about school and chores and whether he felt afraid. Eli shook his head. "She reads to me," he said. "And he fixes things." That seemed to satisfy Reed more than affidavits ever could. On the 4th day, Reed wrote his report. Voluntary residence, mutual consent, no evidence of coercion. He handed the copy to Calder and tipped his hat to Lydia before riding out. Snow fell that night, thick and sure. Calder went out to mend a fence post the wind had loosened. Lydia followed with a lantern, setting it on the rail to give light. The storm had passed, leaving the world wishad and quiet, the sky stretched thin with stars. "I never asked properly," Calder said, hammer resting against his thigh. Lydia tilted her head. "Asked what?" "For you to stay," he said. "Not because the town decided it, not because he lost." She considered him for a moment, the cold reddening her cheeks, the lantern light catching in her eyes. "Then ask," she said. Calder met her gaze, his voice low and unembellished. "Stay," he said. "Not as something owed, as something chosen." Lydia smiled then, not wide, not theatrical. "I already have." They did not kiss. They did not promise what they could not yet name. They stood together beneath the open sky, the work between them finished, the rest left for time. Inside the house, Eli slept, his schoolbook open on his chest, the letter that had begun everything tucked safely between its pages. And the door, as always, remained open. Winter deepened its hold on Red Willow Crossing, not with fury but with persistence. Snow layered itself into corners that the sun could not reach, and the creek near the Boone place slowed to a careful whisper beneath a skin of ice. Days shortened until light felt borrowed, something to be used wisely and returned before it was missed. The house learned new sounds, the steady scrape of boots at the threshold, the low hiss of the stove, the soft cadence of lessons drifting from the parlor each morning. Staying, Lydia discovered, was not a single decision. It was a series of small acts repeated until they became habit. She rose before dawn to set water on the stove and prepare bread, her hands quick and practiced. She did not announce her help or wait for instruction. Calder noticed anyway. He noticed the way the pantry stayed organized, the way the fire never quite went out at night, the way Eli's shirts returned from washing mended rather than merely clean. Calder was a man who trusted work more than words, and Lydia spoke his language fluently. Eli thrived in the quiet structure. He learned to read with a seriousness that surprised even Lydia, his small finger tracing letters as if they might move. He asked questions that bent toward meaning rather than mischief. When he slept hard, dreams untroubled, the way children did when the world around them felt reliable. Calder worked longer hours than usual. The suspension of his winter contracts had forced adjustments, fewer hired hands, more labor carried by his own shoulders. He rose before first light to check fences and returned after dusk with snow clinging to his coat and beard. His hands grew rougher, his knuckles split and healed and split again. Lydia noticed the way fatigue sharpened his angles and softened his voice in equal measure. He did not complain. He never had. But there were evenings when he sat longer than necessary at the table, staring at the grain in the wood as if measuring something he could not name. The town watched from a distance. Sarah Vance stopped by one afternoon under the pretense of delivering supplies Lydia had ordered. She stood in the doorway, coat still on, eyes taking in the room, the books stacked neatly, the children's slates hung by the window, the absence of pretense. "You're doing good work," Sarah said, not unkindly. "You know it won't make everyone kinder." "I'm not trying to," Lydia replied, "just steadier." Sarah nodded. "That'll do." Not all visitors were so neutral. Deke Larn passed the Boone place once, then twice, his glances lingering too long. He made a comment at the saloon about men who forgot their place. It earned him a quiet warning from Sheriff Hale and a colder reception from the town than he expected. Red Willow Crossing had a way of closing ranks when pushed too far. Deke moved on shortly after, the story losing its sharpest tongue. The real test came in late January when illness slipped through the valley like a thief. It began at the mining camp, a fever that burned hot and fast, leaving men weak and children coughing into thin blankets. Lydia went there as soon as she heard, her bag filled with what little medicine the town could spare. She moved from shack to shack, steady and unafraid, her sleeves rolled, her hair pinned tight. May Cutter followed her, carrying water and firewood, her face set with grim resolve. May had lost too much to fear exhaustion. By the third day, the fever reached the Boone place. Eli woke shivering, his skin hot beneath Lydia's hand. Calder stood helpless at the foot of the bed, his jaw clenched, eyes dark with a fear he could not outrun. Lydia sent him for fresh water and herbs without ceremony. She cooled Eli's forehead, coaxed him to drink, and spoke softly through the night, anchoring him to the sound of her voice. The fever broke just before dawn. Calder sat in the chair by the bed long after Eli fell into easy sleep. Lydia found him there later, shoulders slumped, hat in his hands. He did not speak when she approached. He did not need to. She rested a hand on his shoulder, brief and certain, and that was enough to pull him back into himself. News of the illness spread, and with it came a shift in how the town looked at Lydia. She had not come with promises or grand intentions. She had come with clean hands and a willingness to stay. That mattered. When the worst passed, the preacher organized a small gathering at the chapel, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement. Food appeared. Blankets were exchanged. Words were few, but the work was shared. Lydia moved through it quietly, accepting thanks with a nod, refusing praise she had not earned alone. Calder watched her from the back of the room, a new understanding settling into him. He had known strength before, in men, in animals, in land that refused to break. Lydia's strength was different. It was not loud. It didn't demand recognition. It made space for others to recover. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the house fell quiet, Calder spoke the words he had been turning over for weeks. "I don't know how to do this gracefully," he said, standing by the stove, his reflection wavering in the kettle's curve. Lydia looked up from mending a tear in Eli's coat. "Then don't," she said. "Do it honestly." Calder nodded. He took a breath, the sound grounding him. "I've lived a long time thinking if I kept things small, they'd stay safe," he said. "That hasn't proven true." Lydia set the coat aside. "Safety is not the same as stillness," she said. "No," Calder agreed. "And stillness isn't living." He crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance from her. "I won't ask you to be what you aren't," he said. "I won't promise what I can't guarantee, but I will work, I will stay, and I will choose you every day I'm able." Lydia studied him, not searching for romance, but for truth. She found it in the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his gaze, the absence of embellishment. "Then I'll do the same," she said. They didn't seal it with ceremony. They sat at the table and planned practical things, the spring planting, the repairs needed, how to expand the lessons when the roads cleared. The future took shape not as a dream but as a list, and it felt right. The snow eased in February, giving way to a brittle thaw. Fences leaned, then stood again under Calder's hands. The creek broke its ice and ran clearer. Lydia hung the children's work on the parlor wall, a quiet record of progress. Eli read aloud at supper, his voice gaining confidence with each passing day. On a bright afternoon near the end of the month, Calder brought out a small wooden frame he had been carving in the evenings. He held it awkwardly, as if unsure how it might be received. Inside was the letter, the one that had begun everything, its childish script preserved without correction. "I thought it belonged where learning happens," he said. Lydia took it, her eyes misting despite herself. "It belongs where truth is honored," she said, and hung it in the schoolroom. The house settled into itself, no longer feeling borrowed. The door remained open, not out of vigilance, but out of habit. The work of staying continued, quiet, deliberate, and shared. And when spring hinted at return, Red Willow Crossing was ready to remember what it had learned. Spring did not arrive all at once in Red Willow Crossing. It came in negotiations, a longer stretch of light in the evenings, snow retreating from fence lines but clinging stubbornly to shadowed ground. The creek swelled with meltwater and spoke louder than it had all winter, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and renewal that no one trusted completely until it stayed. With the thaw came work that could no longer wait. Calder Boone rode hard those weeks, taking what jobs he could now that the suspension on his winter contracts had run its course. He rebuilt broken agreements the way he rebuilt fences, quietly, without apology, proving reliability through repetition. Men who had once hesitated now met his gaze again, not with curiosity, but with respect returned. Calder did not seek redemption. He accepted what was offered and left the rest alone. Lydia felt the shift before it was spoken. She saw it in how men removed their hats when they passed the house, how women lingered longer at the edge of the schoolroom to ask questions that were no longer sharp with doubt. Acceptance, she had learned, was rarely announced. It arrived disguised as routine. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon, folded into a conversation Lydia had not expected. Preacher Elias Mercer stopped by the Boone place under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hat in hand, his thin shoulders hunched against a breeze that carried more warmth than threat now. His face bore the gentle lines of a man who worried often but believed deeply. "There's been talk," he said, eyes flicking briefly toward the open door where children's voices drifted out, "about making things proper." Lydia did not bristle. She had known this question would surface eventually. "Proper for whom?" she asked calmly. Mercer smiled faintly. "For the town," he said, "and perhaps for you." That evening, Lydia brought it up not as an accusation, but as a fact that deserved light. "They're waiting," she said, setting plates on the table. Not impatiently, just expectantly. Calder considered that while Eli talked excitedly about the creek frogs he'd seen that afternoon. Calder listened, nodded, then tucked the boy into bed later with the same care he gave to any task worth doing. When the house finally quieted, Calder sat across from Lydia at the table, the lamplight warming the planes of his face. "I don't care much for ceremonies," he said. "Never have." "I know," Lydia replied. "But I care about clarity," he continued. "And I care about you not having to answer questions you didn't ask for." Lydia folded her hands. "Then say what you mean," she said, plainly. Calder drew a breath, steadying himself not against fear but against the unfamiliarity of speaking something permanent. "I want you here," he said, "not as a convenience, not as a solution. As my wife, if you'll have that." There was no performance in it, no flourish, just the truth offered carefully like something breakable. Lydia felt emotion rise, not overwhelming, not sudden, but deep and certain. She had been chosen before by circumstance, by expectation, by other people's plans. This was different. This was an invitation that left room for refusal. "Yes," she said simply. They did not announce it immediately. The decision belonged to them first. A week later, Calder rode into town with Lydia beside him in the wagon, Eli perched proudly between them. They stopped in front of the chapel, not for spectacle, but because that was where people gathered when something honest needed witnessing. Sarah Vance stood near the steps, arms crossed, her expression unreadable until Lydia met her eyes. Then Sarah nodded once, sharp and approving. "Well," Sarah said later, handing Lydia a bundle of cloth. "Took you long enough to do it your own way." The wedding was set for the following Sunday. No invitations were printed, no arrangements announced. Word spread as it always did, quietly, carried on glances and assumptions that had finally lost their edge. People brought what they could: wildflowers gathered from the hills, a pie wrapped in linen, a small carved toy for Eli. Nothing extravagant, everything sincere. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and windless. The sky stretched wide and patient. Lydia, dressed in a simple linen gown she had sewn herself over the winter, the fabric pale and unadorned. Her hair was braided loosely and pinned back, a few strands left to move freely. She did not wear gloves. She wanted to feel the day. Calder wore a clean white shirt, freshly pressed, his best coat brushed free of dust. He shaved carefully, the act deliberate, as if marking a threshold. When he looked at himself in the small mirror by the door, he didn't see a man transformed. He saw a man finally aligned. They didn't marry in the chapel. They walked to the creek. The preacher stood waiting beneath the cottonwoods, Bible in hand. The water ran clear and bright behind him, stones visible beneath its surface. Moat lay nearby, ears twitching, alert but calm. Ash grazed a short distance away, tail flicking lazily. Eli stood at Lydia's side, holding a small bundle of wild lavender, his face solemn with the importance of his role. The vows were spoken plainly. No promises of perfection, no claims of rescue. Only words about choosing, about staying, about doing the work even when it grew dull or difficult. Calder's voice did not waver. Lydia's did not either. When the preacher finished, there was no cheer, only a quiet satisfaction that settled over those gathered like a shared breath released. Afterward, people lingered. Children ran along the creek bank. Someone produced a fiddle. Laughter rose, not loud but genuine. Calder stood with Lydia at his side, one hand resting lightly at her back, not as possession, but as acknowledgement. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the house held only the three of them again, Lydia hung the final piece in the schoolroom. It was a small wooden plaque, carved simply, bearing no name, only words: chosen, built, kept. Eli traced the letters with his finger. "That's us," he said with quiet certainty. "Yes," Lydia replied, smiling. "It is." Outside, the wind moved gently through new leaves. The house stood firm. The work ahead remained, but it no longer felt lonely, and for the first time, Red Willow Crossing did not question what it saw. It recognized it. The year turned without asking permission, the way it always did. Summer came back to Red Willow Crossing, not as a promise, but as a consequence of patience. The hills browned, then softened into green again. The creek dropped its roar and learned how to murmur. The wind still moved through the valley, but it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like breath. The Boone place looked different, though no one could have said exactly how at first glance. It was not larger, it was not richer, but it carried the settled look of a place being lived in fully rather than merely occupied. A garden had taken shape behind the house, rows of beans climbing their poles, squash leaves wide and confident, tomatoes ripening in uneven clusters. A new fence traced the edge of the yard, its posts straight and well set, its rails sanded smooth by Calder's hands in the evenings when the light lingered. Inside, the parlor was no longer a parlor at all. It had become a schoolroom. A long table ran the length of the wall beneath the windows. Shelves held slates, books, jars of chalk. The wooden frame Calder had carved hung near the front, holding the letter, the first one, its crooked handwriting preserved without correction or shame. Each morning, children arrived from nearby homesteads and the mining camp, their boots dusty, their faces open. Lydia taught them letters, numbers, and how to speak without apology. She taught them how to listen, which proved harder. Calder passed through the room often, never interrupting, fixing what needed fixing, nodding once at the children who watched him like he was part of the lesson. Eli was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. At 7, he had grown taller, his shoulders squaring, his hair refusing to lie flat no matter how often Lydia tried. His reading had improved quickly, his confidence even more so. He liked to help Calder in the mornings before lessons began, carrying nails, holding boards steady, asking questions that veered between practical and philosophical without warning. "Do fences ever get tired?" he asked once, watching Calder tamp earth around a post. Calder considered this seriously. "They do," he said. "That's why you check them." Eli nodded, satisfied. Moat, grayer now around the muzzle, slept more than he used to, but never deeply. He still rose when strangers approached, still positioned himself where he could see both the house and the yard. Ash, older and slower, carried Calder on shorter rides now, content to graze near the creek when work allowed. The animals had learned the rhythm of the place as surely as the people had. Lydia noticed the change in Calder most in the evenings. He spoke more, not much, but enough. He laughed once in a while, a sound that surprised him as much as anyone else. The deep lines at his eyes remained, but they no longer looked carved by solitude. He touched her in passing without ceremony, a hand at her back, fingers brushing her arm, gestures that carried no question in them. When decisions needed making, he made them with her, not for her. They did not call it happiness, they called it life. The town, too, had changed in its quiet way. Sarah Vance came by on Sundays now, bringing supplies she claimed were overstock but never seemed to charge for. The preacher held lessons in the schoolroom twice a week for adults who wanted to learn their letters without being seen entering the chapel for it. The mining camp sent eggs and flour when they could. Red Willow Crossing did not become kind overnight. It became fairer. That was enough. One afternoon, late in the season, Lydia found herself alone in the schoolroom, tidying shelves while the children played outside. Sunlight slanted through the window, catching dust motes midair. She paused before the framed letter, reading the familiar words again. My pa is real sad. I think he needs someone who can smile big. She smiled, not because the sadness had vanished, but because it no longer ruled the house. A knock sounded at the doorframe. The man standing there was unfamiliar. He was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with a beard worn short and neat, his hair dark and threaded with gray at the temples. His clothes were plain but well cared for, his boots marked by travel. He held his hat in both hands, respectful without being deferential. His eyes were brown and steady, the kind that had learned to watch before speaking. My name's Henry Calloway, he said. I was told I might find Mrs. Boone here. Lydia studied him, noting the way he stood. Balanced, alert, but not threatening. You have, she said. How can I help you? Calloway shifted his weight slightly. I've been contracted by the territorial board, he said. They're looking to formalize schools in smaller settlements. Word reached them about what's been built here. Lydia felt a small, cautious stir. And they want you to lead it, he said, not just here, to help establish others. The offer hung between them, heavy with implication. Calder appeared in the doorway then, drawn by instinct rather than sound. He took in the scene quickly, his expression unreadable but calm. Calloway nodded to him. Mr. Boone. Calder inclined his head. Sir. The conversation moved outside, into the shade of the porch where Eli and the other children sat, legs dangling, listening without pretending not to. Calloway explained the position, seasonal travel, advisory work, training others. It would require Lydia to leave for weeks at a time. It would bring modest pay, recognition, and influence. Calloway finished and waited. Lydia didn't answer immediately. She looked at the house, the yard, the children sprawled on the grass. She looked at Calder. He did not speak. He waited. I won't leave this place, Lydia said finally. Not the way you're asking. Calloway nodded slowly. That's what I hoped, you'd say. She frowned. You hoped I'd refuse? I hoped you'd negotiate, he replied. We don't need you to leave. We need this place to exist. We need something others can point to and say, that's how it's done. If you'll consult from here, train others who come through. I will, Lydia said without hesitation. Calloway smiled then, relief softening his features. Good, he said. That's very good. After he left, Calder and Lydia sat together on the porch steps, the late sun warm against their backs. Eli leaned between them, his head resting against Lydia's side, his fingers idly twisting a blade of grass. You could have gone, Calder said quietly. Yes, Lydia replied, but I didn't need to. He nodded. I would have followed if you did. She turned to him then, searching his face. I know, she said. That's why I stayed. The first harvest came early that year, and the garden produced more than Lydia expected, and what they could not use themselves was shared. One evening, as they shelled beans together at the table, Eli looked up suddenly. We built this place, he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Lydia smiled. We did. Calder added, together. Later, when the house quieted and the stars came out sharp and numerous, Lydia stepped onto the porch alone. The wind moved gently through the grass. She thought of the train platform, the letter, the question she had asked a year ago. And what do you choose? Behind her, the door opened softly. Calder joined her, standing close without touching. I choose this, Lydia said aloud, as if answering the night. Calder nodded. So do I. They stood there until the lamps inside burned low, until the sounds of the house settled into sleep. The land stretched out before them, unchanged and utterly transformed by the simple fact of people who stayed. The boy who had written the letter no longer needed to fix what was broken. The woman who had arrived with nothing but resolve had built something that could last. The man who had learned to stand alone had learned at last to stand with. And Red Willow Crossing, shaped by wind and work and quiet courage, remembered them not as a scandal or a story, but as a family that chose one another and kept choosing, long after the dust had settled. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles the way we expect. They don't always arrive loud or shining. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a child's brave heart, a stranger who chooses kindness, or a door left open when the world says it should stay closed. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always mean forgetting pain. It means choosing love again, choosing to stay, to care, to protect what is fragile, even when it costs us something. If you're watching this today and carrying your own quiet burden, remember this. God sees the unseen. He walks with the forgotten. And He often works through ordinary people who simply decide to do the right thing when it matters most. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances still exist. Leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you the longest or where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing stories of hope, courage, and quiet faith. May God bless you and your home. May He give you strength for today, peace for your heart, and light for every step ahead. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop believing in the miracles that grow quietly.